So among the manuscript leaves for Herman Melville's final unfinished story, Billy Budd, there is what appears to be a draft title page for the volume of poetry that eventually became John Marr and Other Sailors with some Sea Pieces, a volume of poetry that was published in 1888 in a run of only 25 copies. On the manuscript page, the name John Marr is inscribed in blue pencil above the word seaweed, which is struck through. Reconstructing Melville's thinking here poses obvious difficulties. A note on this page in the scholarly edition of Melville's poetry makes the case that he had originally envisaged a collection of poems entitled Seaweed, which the editors link to a volume that may once have also been provisionally called Meadows and Seas. Sometime later, however, they note, Melville cancelled this out and wrote John Marr instead at the top of the sheet. Now, I think it is theoretically possible, of course, that Melville did not write John Marr on this notional title page after deleting Seaweed, but that both were written at the same time, with Seaweed cancelled out sometime further down the line. And either way, I think several possibilities present themselves here. Perhaps Melville was in two frames of mind about whether to call a collection John Marr or Seaweed, or indeed John Marr, Seaweed. Maybe he was experimenting with different titles. Maybe he simply returned to an old scrap of paper to begin a new volume, with the juxtaposition between these two titles arising accidentally. Either way, whatever the intended or unintended connection between these two terms, what I think is interesting are the ways in which we might productively be led to reflect on the relation that emerges between Seaweed and John Marr, the man, as much as the poem and the collection named after him. What might it mean for our thinking about the relationship between poetry and seaweed, and moreover, between the human and seaweed, if we pursue this suggestive overlap and consider the extent to which John Marr might be brought into relation with seaweed, or how seaweed might find itself displaced by John Marr, or vice versa. We might imagine such a poetry as one exploring the moment at which it becomes difficult to disentangle the human from seaweed, or the human from the non-human, or the human from non-sentient matter, perhaps. So in this paper, I am interested in briefly exploring some of these questions and in thinking about the role seaweed plays in Melville's presentations of ecologically framed networks and connections between humans and between humans and the more than human world. I'm especially interested in moments of interchange and entanglement between human and seaweed, which is a term used very generally that covers a range of different marine plants in Melville's work, including kelp, gulfweed, i.e. sargassum, which he also calls driftweed, seagrass, and sea moss. Seaweed in Melville's prose and poetry is alluring. It is something we might die in, wrapped up in it, like a shroud, something that might help us rethink how we appear in the gaze of others. And above all, it is a figure for the recovery of that which is absent, or a means of giving at least partial form and presence to the unrepresentable. Melville's sailors invoke seaweed at moments that they most desire communion with communities from which they have become detached, imagining themselves and their companions in the process as human seaweed or human seaweeds. I'm going to focus on just 4 brief examples from Melville in this paper, but it's worth saying at the outset that references to seaweed in more or less developed ways appear in all of Melville's maritime writing, from his first novel, Typee, to his final unfinished story, Billy Budd, with one curious exception, his second novel, Omu. This is curious because Omu is a novel about beachcombing. And as everyone here will know, I'm sure, the beach is the prime site for engagements with seaweed in the 19th century in Britain and America, whether you're collecting seaweed to dry and press into your albums, or gathering it for fertilizer, as food, or to burn for soda ash. If I were minded to account for this, I would suggest that this is because the beach is not the site in which Melville wishes us to encounter seaweed. Once seaweed is on the beach, it no longer signifies in a way that Melville prizes. It no longer embodies the value Melville invests it with. So a good place to begin fleshing some of these ideas out a bit further is the short poem, The Tuft of Kelp, the only of Melville's texts that directly addresses seaweed. All dripping entangles green, cast up by a lonely sea, if purer for that, O weed, bitterer too are ye. The speaker offers a brief hymn to seaweed that may also be read as an elegy, for it is cast up and out of the waters of the world, undergoing whatever the opposite might be of a sea burial. In his recent analysis of the poem, Tom Nurmi, in his book on Melville and ecology, pushes on the resonance of the imagined bitterness this weed, and by implication the speaker, might be feeling after washing ashore into terrestrial space. As we'll see in a moment, this definitely chimes with other of Melville's characters, like John Marr, who align themselves with seaweed. To be cast ashore is to become stuck, landed, to move out of meaningful kinds of oceanic circulation. But it is the uncertainty of all of this that stands out to me. The poem asks a question, or perhaps two questions, rather than offering any assertions. If kelp is purer, is it also bitterer? What we have here, I think, is a desire to find common ground between the speaker and the seaweed, the assumed human perspective and the non-human interlocutor. And I think there's something chiming here with Rachel's work on Eliza Cook that we've just heard. It is a yearning to imagine what it might feel like to be kelp, but it cannot resolve that yearning. It cannot be sure that it knows the plant. These ideas of yearning, of querying, and of the helplessness that comes from being cast ashore are given further development in the poem I mentioned at the start of this paper, John Marr, which is published in the same volume as The Tuft of Kelp. John Marr is structured like lots of Melville's late career poetry. It begins with a prose narrative before shifting into verse for its final section. This movement enables Melville to do two things: to adopt a new narrative perspective, from the third person narrative of the prose to the first person narrative of the poem, and to offer in verse a resolution to the narrative, to bridge two different worlds, recover something that has been lost within the prose narrative, to re-enter into a community. The prose tells the story of John Marr, who has given up seafaring and settled in a frontier town somewhere in America's Midwest. But he is lonely. His wife and child die, and he has no way of keeping up correspondence with his old shipmates. The other settlers around him don't quite get him. His maritime history and frames of reference are too at variance with the world as they know it. So John Marr, on taking to land, on casting himself ashore, is lonely. And he seeks in imagination to get back in touch with his former shipmates, his chums, as the text calls them. Though John Marr's shipmates could not all have departed life, the tale says, yet as subjects of meditation, they were like phantoms of the dead. He invokes these visionary ones, striving, as it were, to get into verbal communion with them, or under yet stronger illusion, reproaching them for their silence. And then we move into that verse. And this is John Marr speaking now. Ye come, ye visit me, or seem swimming out from seas of faces, alien myriads, memory traces, to enfold me in a dream. I yearn as ye, but rafts that strain, parted shall they lock again. Twined we were, entwined, then riven, ever to new embracements driven, shifting gulfweed of the main. Then how if one here shift no more, lodged by the flinging surge ashore? Nor less, as now in eve's decline, your shadowy fellowship is mine, ye float around me, form and feature. The poem, and this is just a short excerpt from it, repeatedly invokes forms of envelopment. The remembered sailors enfold John Marr, as in a dream. The sailors are like gulfweed being driven to new embracements. The shadowy fellowship encompass Marr as they float around him. There isn't time to explore this idea further, but this reference to floating seems to collate John Marr's ghostly spectral vision with a kind of oceanic buoyancy where the dead or absent are buoyed up by the material quality of the ocean. The poem is using gulfweed particularly to think about being enfolded in communities that are not founded on rootedness in place, for as John Marr's current condition demonstrates, such stasis is undesirable, it is stultifying. Rather, they are predicated on drift and dislocation. Gulfweed provides an apt figure for representing maritime and shipboard experience. It is a rootless plant. Sailors might drift and move relatively readily between different vessels, leaving behind some companions, finding new ones, or perhaps re-encountering former crewmates on new ships. Fluctuation and fluidity, qualities that echo the oceanic environment in which it floats, define this community, whose instabilities are not a source of anxiety, but a prized aspect of it. A ship might circumnavigate the world, losing crew and picking up new sailors at various ports, just as in Melville's shipwreck poetry, the wrecked hulk of a ship might drift around the ocean, gathering seaweed onto its wooden boards as it goes. Are humans and seaweed not rather alike? One of Melville's philosopher sailors might be tempted to muse. The gulfweed also offers a useful figure for thinking about the exact quality of support provided by this community. Reflecting on his former life, John Marr recalls that twined we were, entwined, then riven, ever to new embracements driven. The lines detail a process of being first twined, then entwined, then separated, then finding new embracements in which the whole process might begin again. If something is twined, it is one thing wrapped around another, as we have heard, right? The weed wrapped around the mast in Cook's poem. It is a singular asymmetric form of support. Here then, the individual finds support by twining themselves around other maritime selves, other gulfweeds among which they find themselves. Next, this develops into a process of mutual entwinement in which all are wrapped up with all. These bindings then loosen and the self drifts off to enact other twinings and entwinings elsewhere. Dependency becomes codependency, becomes self-sustainability, returns to dependency, returns to codependency, and so on. It is perhaps this submersion of individual selves within a wider unrooted ecology of selves, as it were, that enables John Marr to say, "I yearn as ye." A statement about a shared emotional world that presumes transparent access to the interior lives of others. The certainty with which John Marr declaims this process of twining and entwining is marked by an emphatic exclamation mark punctuating these lines. Recalling the tenor of the tuft of kelp, however, this certainty is framed by two questions. Rafts that strain parted, shall they lock again? And how if one hears shift no more, lodged by the flinging surge ashore? Marr's exclamation serves to address the first question. Yes, rafts that have parted may lock together again, though not necessarily in the same way as before. The second question, I think, is less surely addressed, and we can imagine the entire text of John Marr as an effort to resolve it. Indeed, a precondition of any community that figures itself in the image of gulfweed must be uncertainty, must be reconciling oneself to the prospect of being cast ashore like Melville's tuft of kelp. It offers an acknowledgement that one is not in control, one cannot be in control of the shape and the makeup, and indeed of one's own place in this community. It is the flinging surge that lodges one ashore. The individual has no agency over this matter. In this respect, the poem suggests that there is a fundamental difference between oceanic separation and terrestrial separation. The former may be temporary, the latter may be permanent. This kind of weedy entanglement and the recovery of a voice from beyond the community, from beyond the grave, in fact, informs the very final line of Melville's final work, Billy Budd, the story that I mentioned at the start that was left unpublished at his death in 1891. So here is the manuscript page for that, with Melville's various emendations visible, dated 5 months or so before his death. Like John Marr, Billy Budd is a story that moves from a lengthy prose narrative to a short final poem. The text as a whole tells the tragic story of a young sailor with a speech impediment who is conscripted into a naval vessel. One of Billy's superior officers takes a disliking to him. Billy's otherwise quite popular among the crew, but he is accused of fomenting a mutiny. The captain doesn't believe this, but he is forced out of protocol to interrogate Billy. When Billy is asked to account for himself, he finds he cannot speak and instead unintentionally lashes out and strikes his accuser, killing him. Again, protocol dictates what happens next. Despite the captain's certainty of Billy's innocence, Billy must be court-martialed. He's found guilty, he's hanged from the yardarm, and he's buried at sea. The closing poem is a ballad, sung by Billy's former shipmates in his memory. It imagines from Billy's perspective his final moments and those moments following his death. It ends, fathoms down, how I'll dream fast asleep. I feel it stealing now, sentry, are you there? Just ease this derbies at the wrist and roll me over fair. I am sleepy and the oozy weeds about me twist. Again, there's more to be said than time allows about this perspectival shift, about the oddly smooth transition from living voice to posthumous voice, and about the casting of Billy's voice into poetic form. I just want to focus briefly on Melville's seaweed. It is a bit of a shame, I think, that Melville substitutes sleepy for drowsy in this final line, which lessens the sense of entanglement between Billy and the weeds, whose ooziness has its phonetic echo in Billy's drowsiness, a suffusion of Billy's state of being by the material quality of the seaweed. Nevertheless, Billy is entangled in these weeds. The strange temporality of this poem, wherein Billy is both imagining his future death and seemingly already cast into the sea, means these oozy weeds which twist about him after his sea burial are already beginning to twine about him before his death. They also function as replacements for the shackles which Billy asks to be loosened. Now, the poem doesn't clarify whether these weeds are rooted or unrooted, but building on Melville's prior deployment of images of weedy entanglement in poems like John Marr, we might imagine Billy's final moment, which is also in a way Melville's final moment, not, as I had once thought, as Billy's being caught in kelp rooted to the bottom of the sea. Rather, in these final moments, Billy is being placed by those sailors who elegize him into that maritime community that, like gulfweed, makes and remakes itself continually. The oozy weeds of these last lines then do to Billy's body what the poem itself does to Billy's memory and voice. It keeps him in circulation, it keeps him entwined. The shackles are loosened, and instead Billy drifts into the weed, into Melville's marine ecology of oozy community. To ooze in Melville's work is to exhibit a kind of vitality and motion. In Typee, his first book, for example, we're told mineral waters ooze forth from the crevices of a rock. And in Moby Dick, the ship's carpenter is described as a pure manipulator. His brain, if he had ever had one, must have early oozed along into the muscles of his fingers. Billy, in this sense, is not imagined as lying lifeless or inert, but buoyed by the weeds. To wrap up, I want to glance beyond his prose and poetry, towards a moment in Melville's books in which we find him framing his own relations with others in weedy terms. As some of you may know, the writer Nathaniel Hawthorne was an extremely important figure in Melville's early career, especially around the early 1850s as he was writing Moby Dick, when the two lived together as neighbors for a short while. Melville's adoration of Hawthorne borders on the rapturous. Here is an example of this, the end of one of Melville's letters to Hawthorne. I won't dwell on it due to time, but it's this PS note where he imagines this paper mill being set up in his house. And on that endless ribbon in the paper mill, I should write 1,000, 1,000,000, billion thoughts, all under the form of a letter to you. The divine magnet is on you, and my magnet responds, which is the biggest? A foolish question. They are one. Hawthorne never felt quite the same about this. Not long after their first meeting in 1850, Melville published a glowing review of Hawthorne's collection of short stories, Mosses from an Old Manse. He really runs with the metaphor of the moss here. Hawthorne is a mossy man. He is that man of mosses. So far, so mossy, not much seaweed. This changes, however, when we open Melville's actual copy of Mosses from an Old Manse. And this is my final slide. On the front paste down of Melville's copy of Hawthorne's book, Melville has pressed some seaweed, specifically sea moss, also known as Irish moss, and he has inscribed this note beneath it. This moss was gathered in Salem, and therefore I place it here for a frontispiece. P.S. It may be objected that this is sea moss, but then it only went to sea, like many young mortals, in its youth, and to my certain knowledge has been ashore ever since. So, what is this doing? By telling us this moss is from Salem, Melville is equating it with Hawthorne, who was born in Salem and who dwelt on Salem's dark histories in lots of his most well-known fiction. The microbiography of the moss that follows, however, aligns it with Melville's own biography. It was he, not Hawthorne, who was a seafaring youth, sailing between 1839 and 1844 on a variety of vessels. The sea moss then transfigures Melville and Hawthorne into that which, for Melville at least, evocatively literalizes that oneness he imagines between the two men in the letter I quoted a moment ago. This then might also be a final instance of using marine algae to help voice a yearning for a type of community and a way of perhaps of suggestively materializing it as well. I will wrap things up there. Thank you very much.